Yeah.
Anyway, we are thinking if you have a time or other things, other logistics we can discuss. I think time is your. If you have a time, we can discuss logistics.
Hmm. Okay. Interestingly enough, I've been hiring graduate research assistants because we have a couple in the in our department, and I've been interviewing a lot of international students, and I've had two students from Hyderabad who've come to me, and it's like, oh, interesting, and they're, oh, have you ever been to Hyderabad? I said, yeah, yeah, I've been to Hyderabad. I have a friend who's up at Harvard, and I was visiting him a few years back. Yeah, it's very interesting. So we have Indian students here on our campus. I'm surprised how many actually, even though numbers, I don't know in at Harvard, Santosh, if numbers are probably much lower for
Yeah.
international students. I mean, this Trump,
It's, yeah.
you know, attack on international students has really, I was talking to our associate provost for international affairs, and she was saying, this is the
रवि अभी
lowest.
रिकॉर्ड शुरू मत करो रवि
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
अभी रिकॉर्डिंग नहीं करना ये इनफॉर्मल जो बातें हो रही हो हाँ
But this is all in Zoom. It will record in Zoom only, sir, not in YouTube.
Oh, are we on YouTube now?
No, no.
I will be start
We,
after
we, we are
recording.
giving YouTube, but that's not will record. You can edit
हाँ
and you to put into YouTube.
After
हाँ
starting the lecture, I will start the
Because
video.
all the
okay
recorded, we are
okay yeah
editing.
yeah
Not all those things we
I'm
cannot put into the
I'm
YouTube.
sorry Jeremy
I
to
think
interrupt you but I
we
just
are
said it don't record
putting
all this.
YouTube in only lecture. What is
Okay
the
okay okay
facts?
then it's okay
Then we can start within 1 minute, sir. I already 10,
But
9.
it is very much interested. Sir, allow him to share that particular.
Arun Kotagaru
That
is
is
from
historical
Uttar
thing.
Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is a very senior man and
what did you say
he's
Arun
a
sir
journalist.
Now, I wanted to listen, Professor Jeremy, what he
yes
was sharing about that his experience. So, though
yeah
we have a 3 to 4 minutes, so let him
uh-huh.
allow to share informally.
Okay
Sure.
yes
No, I was just saying that,
Santosh, Santosh,
yes Anna
you can go ahead. Please start.
yeah Jeremy you're saying something
yeah, no, I was just saying that the numbers for international students at our university are probably the lowest in maybe 10 years or something.
my goodness
She
last
said it was
50
the
years
lowest. Yeah, the lowest from when I mean, she's only been in that role for maybe 5 years, but so I don't, she said it's as long as I've been here, I've never seen a smaller number of international students. And one of the reasons I'm hiring these graduate research assistants is I had somebody that I had chosen for the position who was coming from Nigeria,
right
and we actually were able to find her tuition as well, which is rare for
oh
international students. Our state doesn't do that very often,
yes
but
yes
we were able to find her that money, and then, she had her visa application process on the 24th of January, I think it was. And she writes and says, I got rejected.
oh
And I said,
gosh
how did you get like you have a graduate research assistant stipend and tuition waiver?
still she
Uh,
rejected
She was rejected. Yeah. I said, how? And they don't give reason why. So I asked her why, and she said they didn't tell me any reason. So so now I'm having to pivot and find somebody else for that position because
yeah
I had already actually introduced her we work with the city of Greensboro on this project, and I had introduced her to that side of the project. And yeah, anyway.
Mhm. Okay, shall we start, Anna?
Sir, welcome to Santosh Rawat. I think I need not to introduce him to us. I think he's well known to our groups and in Indian scholarly and intellectual context. I think welcome to Santosh Rawat and Professor Jeremy to have this lecture. I think I'm very happy to introduce you to you are introduced to our this lecture to both of you, and I think already we 7 hours 12 minutes. Then I welcome to those two people. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Lakshmaya sir. And with my heartfelt congratulations to the CDS and team and all organizations that are coordinating, celebrating the 75th Jubilee and anniversary of Indian Constitution, which is holding the largest, one of the largest democracies in the world, and still successfully with all ups and downs. So uh, I'm so happy for this celebration and ongoing commitment to the values that Indian Constitution is teaching to the nation and to the world. In the chain of and the series of this celebration, we have invited various global scholars, and some more are coming in coming months. So I also want my friends to spread the words, and please attend those calls. There are more scholars to join and speak in the series. But this evening, uh, we have uh, a very good friend of mine, and of course, a very accomplished scholar, and a scholar who engages with community, not just with the books, is with us, uh, Professor Jeremy Rinker. Professor Jeremy Rinker is associate professor at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, where Jeremy sort of engages his research that explores the complex intersection between peace building, collective historical trauma, and system of operation. His research agenda spans the globe but has primarily focused on South Asian anti-caste activism narratives. Anti-caste activism, narrative meaning making in conflict, uh, transitional transformative justice processes. Professor Jeremy holds a PhD from George Mason University, uh, uh, Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, uh, and Rosalind Center School of Peace and Conflict Studies in 2009. His master's in Asian religion from University of Hawaii, uh, and he has a bachelor degree from University of Pittsburgh. Along the way, Jeremy also works with uh, several committees and non-profit organizations, offers excellent research and aids. And Dr. Rinker is currently executive director of the Institute for Peace and Harmony, a local Greensboro nonprofit working to promote peace and locally through community building, dialogue, and peace building. Dr. Rinker is also editor for Journal of Transdisciplinary Peace Praxis, an innovative biannual academic journal of peace praxis. Jeremy's research and writing and teaching focuses on root connection between justice and peace, and takes a praxis based approach to the conflict analysis and intervention. Jeremy's credit has a wonderful books, Overcoming Violence in Transdisciplinary Perspective. Uh, Second book is the Guide to Trauma Informed and the Emotionally Mindful Conflict Practices. His third book is on realizing nonviolence resilience, non-liberalism, social trauma, and marginalized violence. And he also has a book on identity, rights, and awareness, anti caste activism in India, and the awakening of justice through discursive practices. Along with his uh, a very profound CV or bio in academic engagements, he is deeply engaged with the community research project, community engagements, research, and he is a great friend to Ambedkarite movement in India, and he is an inspiration to this area where he and I have talked a lot in past, how the justice and conflicts can be anchored in Dr. Ambedkar's and Buddhist teaching, even in Indian context. So I'm very proud and very happy that Jeremy is here with us, and we got him this evening. So we will benefit from his insights. So floor is yours, sir.
Excellent. Thank you for the warm introduction. I appreciate it. It's very nice to be here and you're an inspiration, Dr. Rout, to me. So to hear that I'm an inspiration to you is is always nice. So Dr. Rout and I have been friends for some time through the Triloka Bodha Mahasangha, Sayat the TBMSG, and the or the the movement based out of Nagpur, which I've been in and out of many times. So thank you for inviting me to this, and thanks to the Center for Dalit Studies for hosting these talks on the 75th anniversary of the Constitution. I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to share my screen with a few slides just to give you a kind of a sense of where I'm coming from more than anything else. I think you should be able to see that.
Yeah,
Um, Good.
yeah,
And so
sure.
yeah, so there's the title of what I hope to talk a little bit about today, caste oppression as collective trauma, the Constitution as cure. And I want to say from the outset that I'm not a constitutional expert on the Indian context. I would even say I'm not a constitutional expert on the US context for that matter. I'm actually teaching a course this semester that our state legislator has actually kind of imposed upon the state system. So I'm in the state of North Carolina, which is one of the 50 states of the United States, and I'm in a state system in terms of teaching the UNC system. Most people know University of North Carolina, which is where Michael Jordan, if you watch, the NBA, it's where Michael Jordan played basketball. But I'm down the road about an hour and a half. I was actually at North Carolina State University yesterday, which has another very important basketball team. They went to the Final Four last year. As a matter of fact, delivering my son for his freshman year, he's starting at NC State, another one of the state schools here in North Carolina. So, but I'm at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, um, and am in a Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, which in the state of North Carolina is not a big field or a big discipline. Um, it's, in fact, UNCG has the only peace and conflict studies program in the state. So at NC State, where my son is, there's no program or department called peace and conflict studies, but UNCG is lucky enough to have that. And so I'll talk a little bit about my background coming from that perspective as well. Somebody had asked earlier about email ID. My email ID is on this slide. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, feel free to, use that to reach out to me. I'm happy to be here and thank you for the opportunity to talk. And so my plan today was to kind of, let's see if I can click through. My plan today was to try to do these things. Um, and I would say that, I want to, especially the fifth point on the slide, engaging question and answer in dialogue. So I'm hoping to talk for a little while, and then I'm hoping that we can have some kind of dialogue back and forth, particularly due to the context of constitutions being questioned at this point. One of the reasons I'm teaching that course I mentioned, which I've actually titled Conflict in and democracy, and I put and in parentheses because I'm playing with this idea that conflict is important for democracy, that destructive conflict, of course, is what we want to try to avoid and work through, but that conflict is actually not a bad thing necessarily for a healthy democracy. And so that, in the context that we're in politically at this point in the United States, and I think in India as well, I think it's important to be having these discussions about what does the Constitution mean? Why do we have a Constitution? How can we support the interpretation of the Constitution that allows for people to have equity, equality, and freedom of movement and freedom of thought. I think those are important aspects of what a democratic constitution sets out. So today I want to try to kind of provide a brief overview of my interdisciplinary research, particularly around collective historical trauma, and I'll try to define that a little bit as kind of distinct from individual trauma. And then I'll think about, I want to, why I need to think about this in terms of caste oppressed trauma and thinking about presenting a little bit of qualitative data. And I noticed Lalit was or had hopped on the call with a colleague of mine that is out in Oregon on the west coast of the United States in a social work program. We've been conducting focus group discussions and some survey research around the Dalit diaspora or the Ambedkarite diaspora here in the United States and trying to understand South Asian dynamics in the United States and how caste, as Dr. Ambedkar said, would spread around the world. And it's certainly here in the United States as well, and trying to understand how that's impacting people. I'm going to try to focus particularly on trauma and collective trauma in that connection as well. And then because this is, honoring the Constitution, I want to try to connect the study of caste oppressed trauma to the rule of law and what I would call transitional justice mechanisms. Transitional justice, of course, has lots of I call them mechanisms because um, the fact that there are multiple ways to go about trying to transition a society from past harms, and so transitional justice mechanisms are things like trans Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The one that people mostly think about is the South African example, but there have been lots of truth and reconciliation mechanisms around the world. But also opportunities to dialogue and bring people together. Things like memorialization, creating, memorializing past harms and past issues, things like that. So the kind of work I do is in that kind of broad field of what I would call transitional justice. Um, and then the last couple things is highlight why this is especially, and I mentioned this before, why this is especially important for our current global political milieu, and the kind of rightward swing that we're seeing in I think world politics as a whole. And then again, I want to spend time, making sure we have time to um, to talk and have dialogue around some of these issues that I raise. So I'll raise some issues and then hopefully there'll be some questions and dialogues that we can have. So I want to just say that Ambedkar, um, again, I'm not an expert on the Constitution, and we know that Baba Saheb or Dr. B.R. Ambedkar spent so much time, particularly towards the end of his career, writing the Constitution, drafting the Constitution. And I was, as I kind of prepared for this talk, I went and I was just looking at reading through a few of the articles of the Constitution, and I've just recently been reading the U.S. Constitution as well, which we put out in small little booklets, right? And I pulled up the English version of the Indian Constitution, and it's 400 pages long. It's a huge document, a huge amount of work that was put into developing it. Some of that is, of course, the table of context and outlining what's in it, but it's such a huge document and a huge piece of work that Dr. Ambedkar was, of course, leading the drafting commission on. I see Ambedkar very much as what I would call a conflict transformation practitioner, or what we might call a peace builder. And so in my field, we talk a bit about peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. The United Nations has become really good at doing peacekeeping, stopping kind of what we would call negative peace, standing in between a conflict situation and stopping parties from war, from killing each other, basically. That's what we call a negative peace, because you're not really changing the dynamic necessarily. You're just stopping the violence from happening. Not that that's unimportant, that's an important thing to do. But what we try to study and push towards is really getting parties to the table, which we might call peacemaking, where they can just dialogue and talk about their issues. And just yesterday, of course, Trump brought one party to the table, but not two in the Ukraine conflict, which is not really what I would even call peacemaking. It's more diplomacy and trying to, I mean, maybe it's a positive step. We'll see what comes out of that. But really, what we're pushing for in the field of peace and conflict studies is peace building, right? How do we move from a negative peace to a positive peace? How do we move to a space where everyone feels connected to society, everybody feels free and able and well, able to be able to engage with society. And so that I see Ambedkar as, as I look at my field and think of what is peace building, Ambedkar is certainly a peace builder. And these are just three reasons that I have on this slide why, but I think you could probably add many more reasons to this list. As I was thinking about him as a constitution builder, him as somebody who converted to Buddhism as a way out of the caste system. This pragmatic approach to what I would call principled negotiation, separating the people from the problem. He was very clear to say the practices of Hinduism are the problem, not the people of Hinduism, right? So not the Hindu people. He was willing to bring them in and to build fraternity. His insistence on that idea of fraternity, or Maitri, Metta, or Bandhuta, this radical Buddhist belief in the interdependence of all beings and codependent origination, that we're all connected. So if you think from a kind of a nonviolent perspective, and I've recently been reading about, I'm not a physicist, but kind of quantum physics and particle physics at the micro level, when atoms or particles or quarks are entangled with each other, they can be separated by great distance and they still have an interaction with each other. They've become entangled in a way that they're codependent upon each other. And I think that kind of understanding of the world of codependent origination, and the fact that we're all interrelated and interdependent on each other, really leads us to kind of a radical form of nonviolence. And I think and I think Ambedkar was thinking in those ways. And so this belief and value system of nonviolence, and that nonviolence is always going to be better than violence, and that it's actually a moral, ethical reality that we are, by me harming you, I'm harming myself, right? If there's such a thing as self in the Buddhist concept, so that kind of radical independence really makes him a peace builder. And then the last one is really more related to the Constitution: trust in the law, this belief in the rule of law, in establishing a context for developing relational patterns. And John Paul Lederach is kind of a famous. He's often thought of as the kind of grandfather of peace building, and he talks about these real, context for relational patterns between people in society. While late in Ambedkar's life, he came to realize his work on the Constitution could not fully eradicate caste on its own. For him, it still remained a vital grounding for change. If you don't have that rule of law established, then it's easy for people to choose to take other paths, right? To choose to not create relational patterns in which you interact with the other. Um, And so those ideas really stuck out to me or stick out to me as really and Ambedkar, was alive and living before this terminology of kind of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building really existed. That really comes out of the 1990 agenda for peace that Boutros Ghali, one of the former Secretary Generals of the United Nations, wrote in the 1990s to try to organize the UN system. Um, so peace and conflict studies as a field is really aimed at nonviolent approaches to destructive conflict, right? Um, this is clearly Dr. Ambedkar's approach. It's not to say that we should get rid of conflict because there's such a thing as constructive conflict, conflict that constructs society, right? And conflict within democracies, as I said before, can be a good thing. So his constitution was not trying to kind of eradicate conflict. It was trying to eradicate destructive conflict, and Article 17, of course, the abolition of untouchability is an example of that. And so I really see him as a peace builder. And the last thing I'll say about peace building and in my field in a way is that it's a praxis endeavor. And what I mean by praxis is that it's theory informed practice and practice informed theory. It's this belief that both theory and practice are necessary to make change in the world. And I think Ambedkar is a perfect example of somebody who maybe not initially, but through his career came to realize that praxis is critical, right? You see it in his career trajectory. He becomes the first law minister, he becomes the head of the drafting commission, and then somewhat frustratedly leaves those posts or leaves the post of the first law minister, and begins to build political parties, begins to build movements and became almost an institution builder, partly because he realized that just having the theory of the Constitution written and set and rule of law written and set in stone does not mean that the practice of it is going to happen, that society is going to change. And so this idea of praxis is really important to my field of peace and conflict studies. Theory informed practice and practice informed theory, that the two, and unfortunately in the academic world, theory tends to take the lead, right? And oftentimes practitioners aren't given their full due. And so I think Ambedkar was both a theoretician and a practitioner. He was using his knowledge to apply that knowledge to create change. So why talk about, let me see if I can shift slides. Why talk about collective historical trauma? Um, what do I mean by that? I feel it's a critical root cause of most social conflict. I feel it's also partly missed by my field. My recent book that Dr. Rout mentioned is a practitioner's guide to emotionally mindful and trauma-informed conflict practice. And I'm really arguing in that book that my field has focused on needs, interests, and rational thought of actors, like the conflict management side of my field, or the peacekeeping and peace making field, has really kind of tried to focus on this idea that actors are rational and that they're going to come to the table and they're going to talk about their interests and come up with peaceful solutions to their problems, which is of course a useful endeavor. But I think it misses the fact that emotions and trauma play into that. And we know from research psychologically that people who have been traumatized do not always act rationally, right? They lose some of their rationality in some ways, or they think in different ways because their brain has literally been rewired in order to think in new ways. And so collective trauma stems from this kind of unequal elements embedded in cultural systems and often are made visible by what Johann Galtung, another one who's thought of as a kind of a grandfather of the peace studies field, called cultural violence. He wrote quite a bit about structural, direct, and cultural violence. And for him, the kind of perfect example of cultural violence is if you were to go to France and see the laws being passed against wearing the hijab for Muslims, inability to wear the hijab, he would call that cultural violence because the society is trying to impinge upon the psychosocial potential of somebody by identifying a cultural element and saying this is outlawed in France, right? So that's just one example of what kind of cultural violence would be. This type of collective historical trauma does not necessarily stem from one single event. Instead, it emerges from a long history of communities' experiences with systems of oppression. So I think the caste system is a perfect example. We can talk about a single individual who was discriminated against and has caste trauma, individual caste trauma. But then we can also talk about what's the impact of that. And what I'm interested in really is what's the impact of that on the society as a whole? How does that impinge the democratic process? How does that lead to continual conflict, to perpetual mistrust? All of these things are I think, critical, and they're transgenerational. They've come from not just your own experiences of caste discrimination, but your parents, your grandparents. There's been lots of research that's been done around trauma at showing that, the Holocaust, for example, children whose parents were in the were either killed or lived through a concentration camp in the Holocaust, they still have impacts, and even their grandchildren have impacts from that traumatic, horrific experience. So, like violence, trauma carries with it a series of unknowns and unknown and hidden consequences. And so it makes it really difficult to define, to demarcate, and to study. So while collective historical trauma clearly exists and spreads through collectives and across generations, and some writing has been done on this, Vamik Volkan in particular has written quite a bit about what he wrote a book called Bloodlines in 1988, and sorry, 98, in which he was, arguing for this kind of idea that groups take on chosen glories and chosen traumas, and they perpetuate conflicts based upon those chosen traumas oftentimes. So understanding how this kind of collective historical trauma operates and interacts with marginalized communities, such as the South Asian diaspora in North America, for example, remains difficult because it's a hard thing to study. First, it's a hard thing to build trust with people who want to tell their stories. And then once they do, how do we understand that individual story in a more collective in a more collective sense? How does it impact the activism, the action, the praxis of what those those folks are dealing with, and how they're choosing to respond to it? So preliminary research shows it's critical to understanding that it being collective historical trauma, I think, is critical to understanding how South Asian communities in the diaspora both assimilate to their new spaces and places and collectively organize for anti-caste activism and resistance to this unique form of transgenerational oppression. And that idea of transgenerational I was mentioning before, Volkan talks a lot about. He was a psychologist who studied how it spread from one family to the next, from one family member to the next through generations. And so he called that transgenerational transmission, and showed clearly that happens in all sorts of communities, not just the Holocaust, but there's been lots of research done around Native American traditions in the United States and Native American communities, and um, how collective historical trauma has transgenerationally transmitted through those spaces as well. Um, so I want to say a few things about the work that Dr. Kandare and myself have been doing, in terms of the focus groups that we've been running. We did some survey work and some focus group work. Um, and during 7 focus group discussions between April 2022 and January 2023, and these were respondents who were based in the United States, who came from India or South Asia, some from Nepal or other places as well. around South Asia, but all who had come with experiences of caste. And we interviewed them about we had focus groups with them about their experience of coming to the United States, um, and arriving and negotiating caste, religion, and cultural dynamics in this new diasporic context of the United States. And so during our focus group discussions, our team identified these kind of five key recurrent themes that respondents, um, consistently talked about in terms of their discriminatory experiences: the journey to to North America, ongoing trauma of caste experiences back home. So, and that's the one I want to focus mostly on. I'll come back to that. Fresh caste chauvinism, respondents from respondents' new home. So, like, experiences they had once they came here of caste discrimination, caste experiences as they relate to civic and religious engagement as they tried to assimilate and connect with other South Asian communities in the US, and kind of shared coping mechanisms for overcoming caste traumas. And this last one, Dr. Kandare, Dr. Datkode, and myself are actually about to come out with an article in the Journal of Transient Migration. Hopefully soon it will be out. I'm not sure exactly of the date, but within the next month or so, hopefully, around this last fifth point. But today I want to focus a little more on the second point: ongoing trauma of caste experiences back home. One of the things we noticed in doing these focus group discussions was that we were trying to drive respondents to talk about their experiences here in the United States. And most of the time, the vast majority of the time, respondents would veer back to, well, this happened to me in India, or this happened to me in Nepal. They veer back to experiences of either their family or their parents, even sometimes, or themselves, the experiences that they had, and the frustrations, the anger, the mistrust, the emotional resonance of that was very clear to us as we talk to people. And so trying to understand, how does that impact their experiences of assimilation here in the United States? And so these are just some comments we heard from our SGDs. Notice that largely hidden nature of this form of discrimination to US born Americans. That's including South Asians and non-South Asians like myself. Um, I don't think very many people in the United States, A, know who Dr. Ambedkar is, and B, know that caste is a living and present form of oppression in the world today. They think, oh yeah, that's something that happens in India, if it happens at all, or it's already passed. It happened in the past, right? So they just don't have a lot of experience of that. And so these are some of the comments we heard from people as we interviewed or as we did focus group discussions with them. One person said, I hid my caste for 24 years. Another one said, one of my friends here called me to a party with her. When I introduced myself by name, everyone in the house party was not comfortable. So there's this sense of kind of social ostracism, this sense of, kind of reactions of people. They comment, oh, by your face, you don't look like a Dalit, you know? Like there's a certain look, if you will. My manager somehow found my cast and started treating me differently. So these are people, a lot of these folks were people who were in the IT industry or other industries here in the United States who came, for work and moved for that and work with other South Asians. So we do, and this is true from Equality Labs data too. We see a lot of experiences of caste discrimination are happening in spaces like workspaces and religious spaces in which South Asian communities would come together. Um, Participating in the Hindu festivals, they will ask about caste practices that make an impact, and that makes an impact. I chose like-minded people and don't ask about vegetarian who don't ask about vegetarianism and so on. So like these kind of ideas of well, are you a vegetarian or non-veg is a kind of a coded question. And so this ability to code switch, if you will, that South Asian activists and South Asian communities have to do. And then one person said I face caste more here in the US. Here, upper caste only helps their own caste communities within housing. Also, I face the caste system. So this kind of and that I think it can be more pronounced when people come to the United States because they're isolated as an international person. This is true for any international person who comes, they're isolated, and therefore then they feel they want to try to reach out. They're trying to make connections, and the caste discrimination can be very pronounced in those kinds of settings. Um, so so why is to the question of the Constitution, why is Ambedkar's Constitution so critical to curing such social ills? This kind of transgenerational transmission that I've been discussing, this fear and mistrust and experiences of discrimination that are hard to get over. And I'm not proposing that people should just get over their caste discrimination by any means, but this kind of the legacy that creates in terms of collective historical trauma is very endemic to the community and very difficult to unseat. Um, and so, I think the Constitution kind of is critical for this role because it sets the peace building platform. Again, I'm kind of thinking of Letterock, John Paul Letterock, who's a well-known grandfather of peace building, who talks about building platforms for peace. And he's not peace building, he sees as very much a generational thing. It is not, you know, I think in the United States, we like to have things done yesterday, right? We're very, very much oriented towards, solutions and problem solving and not, and getting things done quickly. And in Letterock's sense of peace building happens in a generational view. It takes time. So none of the work of kind of annihilating caste is going to happen overnight in his kind of a sense.
Well,
Um, yeah, and so
भूतड़ी है
so what's that?
भूतड़ी है
Can you please mute Anand? Uh, Please keep your mobile or your devices mute.
So I'm almost done here. I want to jump to kind of some questions and things too, but this kind of if I'm trying to think about collective historical trauma and then connect it to caste, I was trying to think through like what are connected to the Constitution. Sorry, what is it that the Constitution does for anti-caste activists and for the caste community? I mean, it sets the peace building platform, as Letterock says, for the possibility of these kind of transitional justice mechanisms, for the possibility that we might be able to dialogue, that we might be able to create some memorialization. We see Ambedkar statues all over the country, and in some ways that's a way to memorialize the pains, the harms, the traumas of the past. And I think these are steps towards eventually building peace in this kind of generational view. The rule of law also opens space and structure in society to voice traumas and educate others about the hidden and embedded discrimination practices. So when you hear that, oh, it's not happening, caste is an old thing, it's no longer happening, the rule of law opens up the spaces for people to say, well, actually, let me tell you about my experience and let me explain that it is still happening. The Constitution grounds justice as about equality, which is the basis of fraternity. And of course, those were concepts that clearly resonate in a lot of other writings that Ambedkar did. But when you look at the Constitution, you see that the centrality of equality. And you don't see as much about fraternity, but you definitely understand if you know Ambedkar that that's for him, the basis is trying to establish some fraternity between people. And that goes back to that idea I was saying before of separating the people from the problem. I don't think Ambedkar was ever trying to alienate Hindus, right? He was certainly frustrated with Hinduism, but he was trying to also say, look, these guys are the majority of our population, 80% or so of our population. And so we have to engage them in some way. We can't just alienate them and decide we don't want to talk to them. We have to deal with them. Um, and so the Constitution forms the basis for claims of rights and public policy aimed at protection and correction of these social ills of caste oppression, and really leads us towards the healing of caste trauma. And so the Constitution grounds that. And so for Ambedkar, and I think for the Indian society, we have this document which is ratified and taken on by the entire nation, and it's not just a nationalist kind of a vision. It's a vision of an ability to claim rights by all populations, that everyone is equal, and that we can work towards the healing of caste through those systems. Now we all know that the Indian court system is backlogged with tons of cases, many of which relate to caste, some of which don't. But that process of claiming rights can be structurally problematic in India, but like theoretically at least, the system is in place. The legal codes through the Constitution are in place that will allow for that. And so using those access points to create transitional justice mechanisms is critical. So while I would say the Constitution alone cannot annihilate caste oppression cannot be annihilated without the Constitution, that the Constitution is critical for that process. It's not the only thing that's critical for that process. And so I don't think that activists should put all of their weight on the Constitution, but certainly a big part of it. And without it, it would be impossible to do the work of alleviate or annihilating caste oppression. Um, and I think Ambedkar realized that, Article 17, the abolition of untouchability, does not end the transgenerational transmission of trauma. It continues even as that article sits within the Constitution. So that's not to say that Article 17 is unimportant. It's just to say that that's only one piece of trying to annihilate caste. And I'm arguing that the processing of some of that trauma collectively, and when I talk about trauma, I really mean collective trauma. I'm not a psychologist who's wants to sit down and do therapy sessions, right? But I do think creating collective spaces where people can discuss their trauma and work through some of that trauma and that transgenerational transmission of it is really important for the abolition of untouchability, for the realization of Article 17. Um, and without that, Article 17 just sits on a piece of paper, and the reality in practice is quite different than what the theory is. And so coming back to my field of thinking about praxis, theory informed practice and practice informed theory, the theory within something like Article 17 is critical to have, but without some ways to engage it in practice, it won't solve the problem of caste. And so you need both. You need that praxis kind of an approach. So that's really my kind of my thoughts on the Constitution and Ambedkar's connection, and why I would say that collective historical trauma is so important to understand and to work with, and that the Constitution can be a cure for it. It's not the only cure, but it's an important part of the medicine that needs to be imbibed in order for caste annihilation to happen. So I'm going to leave it at that and allow people to ask questions, and maybe we can have a little bit of dialogue. Thank you very much.
Mhm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this very succinct and condensed presentation, which can be unfolded in many, many ways. And you made very specific, focused points. Uh, Thank you very much for these wonderful reflections. Of course, the main. Uh, shall I speak in Hindi? And that's what I said.
Yes, yes, yes. Please brief, then 5-10 minutes, whatever Jeremy told in English.
In Hindi?
In Hindi, in Hindi.
Hmm.
Okay, there are some North Indians and also across the country. So, uh, anyway, प्रोफेसर जेरेमी बताने की कोशिश कर रहे थे कि भाई ड्रामा और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन दोनों बातें कैसी आपस में मिली जुली है। और उन्होंने तीन तीन स्टेजेस बताए। निगेटिव पीस, यानी जिसको हम पीस कीपिंग कहते हैं, और एक होता है कि पीस बिल्डिंग और सस्टेनेंस। ये तीन स्टेजेस है। तो केवल वायलेंस रोकना पर्याप्त नहीं है। वो एक निगेटिव पीस है। निगेटिव पीस मतलब केवल उसको रोकना, लेकिन उसके बारे में कुछ करना नहीं, उसको कुछ चेंज नहीं करना, वो परिस्थितियों को बदलना नहीं, वो पर्याप्त नहीं है। दैट्स नॉट इनफ जस्ट टू चेंज, just to stop violence. We have to do something about why violence is happening. We have to go into the roots of it. That's what Dr. Ambedkar was trying to do, which is a
Santosh, Santosh
positive.
ji, again you are talking in English.
Oh,
Please
sorry.
indulge.
उसको पॉजिटिव पॉजिटिव पीस, निगेटिव पीस को पॉजिटिव पीस में तब्दील करना बहुत ज़रूरी है। वो इसलिए ज़रूरी है क्योंकि केवल उसको उसके ऊपर रोक लगाना तो ज़रूरी है, जो जेरेमी जी कह रहे थे कि भाई वो इम्पोर्टेंट है, सिग्निफिकेंट है, लेकिन पर्याप्त नहीं है, इनफ नहीं है। उसके आगे जाना बहुत ज़रूरी है, क्योंकि उसके कारणों को रोकना बहुत ज़रूरी है। उसके लिए आप लॉ के ऊपर ट्रस्ट कर सकते हो। एक रूल ऑफ लॉ जो एक्सप्रेशन उन्होंने यूज़ किया, कि लॉ एक बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट फ्रेमवर्क है उस पीस बिल्डिंग प्रोसेस को एक्सेलरेट करने के लिए या इलेवेट करने के लिए, जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का फ्रेमवर्क प्रदान करता है या देता है। ये नई बात नहीं है, पूरे दुनिया में ये प्रयास हुए हैं 1990s के हवाले से, या उसका दाखिला देकर जेरेमी जी बता रहे थे कि यूएन ने भी ये कैसे प्रयास, ये पॉलिसीज, पीस कीपिंग, पीस मेकिंग और पीस बिल्डिंग, यानी वायलेंस को रोकना मतलब शांति प्रस्थापित करना, लेकिन शांति बनाना, शांति को क्रिएट करना, उसको इस्टेब्लिश करना, और फिर उसको सस्टेन रखना, वो बरकरार रहनी चाहिए। ऐसा नहीं कि एक कास्ट एट्रोसिटी हो गई, उसको न्याय मिल गया और उस गांव में या उस शहर में या उस कस्बे में शांति आ गई, बस इतना ज़रूरी नहीं है। उसको बरकरार रखना, उसको मेंटेन रखने का कुछ मैकेनिज्म होना चाहिए। उस मैकेनिज्म की जेरेमी जी बात कर रहे थे, और वो नॉन वायलेंट होने चाहिए। एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट बात जेरेमी जी ने बताई अपने प्रेजेंटेशन में, कि डेमोक्रेसी में अगर अड़चने हैं या कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है, तो उसको नज़रअंदाज नहीं करना चाहिए। बाबा साहब ने वो नहीं किया। वो बता रहे डेमोक्रेसी में वाद विवाद होना ज़रूरी है। डेमोक्रेसी में जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स होते हैं, जो परेशानियां आती है, वो हेल्दी डेमोक्रेसी को क्रिएट कर सकती है। और इसीलिए अपोजिशन होता है, कि अपोजिशन आपके प्रॉब्लम को क्रिटिसाइज करे, और वो क्रिटिसाइज इसलिए करता है क्योंकि उसका निरासरण हो, उसका सॉल्यूशन निकले। ये जरूरी है। इसलिए अवॉइडिंग कॉन्फ्लिक्ट नहीं है। और अगर हम उसको देखते हैं बुद्धिस्ट पर्सपेक्टिव से, जो उन्होंने बताया, मैत्री और फ्रैटर्निटी का जो स्पिरिट लाया, तो बुद्धिस्ट मैकेनिज्म क्या है? सफरिंग अगर है, दुख अगर है, तो दुख को नजरअंदाज नहीं करना है। अरे लोग मर रहे हैं, लेकिन मुझे तो खाना मिल रहा है ना, लेकिन उधर पानी नहीं मिल रहा है, मेरे तरफ तो पानी आ रहा है ना। ये हो गया सफरिंग को नजरअंदाज करना। बुद्धिस्ट मेथोडोलॉजी वो नहीं है। बुद्धिस्ट मेथोडोलॉजी सफरिंग को फेस करती है और उसको ट्रांसफॉर्म करती है। तब कहाँ शांति प्रस्थापित हो सकती है। तो वो मैकेनिज्म, वो मेथड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन देता है, आर्टिकल 17 का उन्होंने बताया कि अनटचेबिलिटी है, लेकिन अनटचेबिलिटी को केवल थियोरटिकली एबोलिश करना इंपॉर्टेंट है, क्योंकि वो लॉ बन गया है, वो रूल है। आप छुआछूत प्रैक्टिस नहीं कर सकते इंडिया में, लेकिन कितने लोग इस लॉ से डरते हैं। जैसे आप चोरी नहीं कर सकते, किसी का खून नहीं कर सकते, ये अनलॉफुल है, ये लॉ के अगेंस्ट है। वैसे ही छुआछूत भी लॉ के अगेंस्ट है, लेकिन उस लॉ का भय कितना है, उस लॉ का प्रेशर कितना है, तो वो इंपॉर्टेंट है। लेकिन वो केवल थ्योरी बन के नहीं रहना चाहिए, ये उनका आर्गुमेंट है। ये जरूरी है कि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मेजर्स इंपॉर्टेंट है, लेकिन केवल उतना ही पर्याप्त नहीं है। लोगों में वो जागृति या उस प्रकार का लॉ का अवेयरनेस आना और उसको बिल्डअप करना, जो जो कल्चरल या सोशल वायलेंस पैदा ना करे। जो गलटोंग एक थिंकर है, उसको वो कोट करते हुए वो बता रहे थे। एक तीसरा और सॉरी चौथा इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट जेरेमी ने बताया, ट्रांस जनरेशनल ट्रांसमिशन ऑफ ट्रामा। ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। ट्रांस जनरेशनल क्या होता है? मान लो इस मीटिंग में जितने लोग हैं या जो लोग इस टॉक को सुन रहे हैं, हर किसी के ऊपर कास्ट एट्रोसिटी हुई हो जरूरी नहीं है। लेकिन इसका मतलब ऐसा नहीं है कि हमारे ऊपर पर्सनली कास्ट एट्रोसिटी नहीं हुई है तो वो आपके जनरेशन से आई हुई नहीं है। कहीं ना कहीं हम उस कंसर्न से यहाँ इकट्ठा बैठे हुए हैं, सोच रहे हैं इसके बारे में कि ये पास्ट में जो हुआ उसका कॉन्सिक्वेंस अभी हमारे मनस्थिति के ऊपर होता है। तो उनका जो रिसर्च है, तो अमेरिका में लोग आए हुए हैं, वो नेपाल से हो या साउथ एशिया के किसी भी कंट्री से आए हुए हो, यहाँ उनको लगता है कि अमेरिका में कास्ट नहीं है तो हम कास्ट से मुक्त हो गए, ऐसा नहीं है। यहाँ पे भी लोग अपनी जातियाँ छुपाते हैं, अपनी आइडेंटिटी छुपाते हैं, या एक अपनी नई आइडेंटिटी, मैं उस खेमे से नहीं हूँ या उस ग्रुप से नहीं हूँ, मैं इस कास्ट से नहीं हूँ, उस रिलीजन से नहीं हूँ, ऐसा एक प्रिटेंशन करते हैं। ऐसा एक प्रिटेंशियस नोशन होता है। तो इसका मतलब ये हुआ
What happening?
Maybe some problem, sir, with the internet. Santosh, sir.
Yeah, I think he maybe froze.
Okay, I think thanks, Jeremy. I think you are what I thinking on the constitution thing. You clearly, please continue, sir. Please. Sometime you stop.
You're
Hello,
muted.
you are
You're
not hearing.
muted.
अभी अभी मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
अभी
Yes,
आ रही
sir.
है, अभी आ
Yes,
रही
sir. Yes, sir.
हाँ। तो उनका जो डेटा है, उनका जो रिसर्च है, जो प्रोफेसर ललित खंडारे जी के साथ उन्होंने किया और अपने कलीग्स के साथ, कि मैं उस कास्ट से नहीं हूँ या हिंदू फेस्टिवल में जाता हूँ, कास्ट बताता हूँ तो मेरा बिहेवियर बदल जाता है। आप कॉरपोरेट वर्ल्ड में हो, आपका मैनेजर आपकी कास्ट जानता है तो आपके बिहेवियर बदल जाते हैं। आई चूज टू बी लाइक माइंडेड पीपल, तो मैं अपने ही कास्ट ग्रुप के लोगों के साथ अपनी फ्रैटर्निटी बढ़ाता हूँ। ये इम्पोर्टेंट नहीं है। सॉरी, ये इम्पोर्टेंट इंडिकेटर्स है, ये इम्पोर्टेंट ऑब्जर्वेशंस है उनके, कि भाई इंटरनेशनल होकर भी मैं आइसोलेट कैसे होता हूँ। बाबा साहब ने ये बात कही थी कि कैसे जाति एक ग्लोबल प्रॉब्लम बन सकती है। अगर बाहर कोई इंडियन जाता है तो वो अपनी जाति साथ में लेके जाता है, तो धीरे धीरे जितना ये फैलेगा तो ये ग्लोबल प्रॉब्लम बन जाएगा। और उसके जो आसार है, उसके जो इंडिकेटर्स है, वो हमें ऑलरेडी दिखते हैं। लेकिन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एक पॉसिबिलिटी प्रदान करता है, एक एक फ्रेमवर्क प्रदान करता है जिससे हम इस इस प्रॉब्लम को सुलझ सकते हैं। और उसका जो रूट है, उसका जो मैकेनिज्म है, वो फ्रैटर्नल होना चाहिए, नॉन वायलेंट होना चाहिए। ये बुद्धिस्ट इंसाइट से बाबा साहब ने या डॉक्टर आम्बेडकर ने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में या मैकेनिज्म, उनका जो उसका जो प्रोसेस है उसमें उन्होंने डालने की कोशिश की है। लास्टली एक इम्पोर्टेंट पॉइंट और जेरेमी जी ने बताया कि आप प्रॉब्लम को पीपल से सेपरेट मत करो। अगर हिंदू लोग हैं तो हिंदू लोगों के बीच मुस्लिम रहते हैं, अलग अलग जातियों के लोग रहते हैं, माइनॉरिटीज रहते हैं, क्रिश्चियंस रहते हैं, और ये एक दूसरे के साथ लोग रहते हैं। तो बाबा साहब ने उन लोगों को डिनाई करके चलो एक कास्टलेस सोसाइटी बनेगी, ऐसा नहीं सोचा। वो जो लोग उनके साथ असहमत थे उनके साथ बाबा साहब एंगेज हुए, उनके साथ बाबा साहब ने डायलॉग किया, उनके साथ उन्होंने वार्तालाप करने की कोशिश की। वो एक डेमोक्रेटिक तरीका है। केवल नेशनलिज्म की बात या केवल नेशनलिस्ट होने से पर्याप्त नहीं है, लेकिन नेशन लोगों से बनता है। ये बाबा साहब ने बोला, फ्रीडम ऑफ द पीपल और फ्रीडम ऑफ द कंट्री, ये दो डिफरेंशिएशन डॉक्टर आम्बेडकर ने की है। फ्रीडम ऑफ द पीपल एंड फ्रीडम ऑफ द कंट्री दोनों इंटरलिंक्ड है। देश को एक देश की भाषा में जोड़ के लोगों को इग्नोर करना, ये सेपरेट करना, ये मैकेनिज्म नहीं है। ये डॉक्टर आम्बेडकर की मेथोडोलॉजी है। सो इसीलिए वो जो लीगल प्रोटेक्शन के साथ साथ एक कम्युनिटी बिल्डअप होना, एक सोशल फॉर्मेशन होना बहुत ज़रूरी है। उस हिसाब से जेरेमी जी ने कंक्लूड किया कि थ्योरी और रियलिटी अलग अलग नहीं हो सकती, आपका प्रैक्टिस होना चाहिए। जो 17 आर्टिकल है, अनटचेबिलिटी, एबोलिशन ऑफ अनटचेबिलिटी, वो प्रैक्टिस भी होनी चाहिए। नहीं तो केवल वो कानून किताबों में रहेगा और उसके सोशल एक्सपीरियंसेस कॉन्ट्राडिक्ट होंगे, तो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बढ़ेगा, पीस बिल्डिंग नहीं होगा। दैट्स व्हाट जेरेमी वाज ट्राइंग टू sort of encourage to think us, that mere theory and practice in separation will not do. If we have to understand and come into a terms with the peace as a reality, that has to be practiced, not merely freeze into the books or mere sort of mute law. That's what not Dr. Ambedkar was trying to say. So he is arguing that constitution is important, but we have to work more than a constitution to make it happen as a reality. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for this important insight. I hope I encapsulate the gist of the talk. Now I invite friends, if you have questions. I would say I just have a small request before I open up a floor for the people. Uh, if you have a comment, we will welcome comment, but please be brief in your comment. Otherwise, we go into personal stories and miss what has been we are trying to establish, what Professor Jeremy was trying to discuss. So please, my request, humble request, be focused on your comment and question, because we have to respect time for him and for us too. Thank you. So I welcome your questions.
So shall I offer my comment?
If you
Sure,
have
sir.
questions,
Sure.
sir, yeah, and please be brief.
Oh yes.
Please introduce
First of
yourself and ask the question.
it is not a question, but I want to highlight certain portion of Mr. Jeremy's presentation. That is the last point of his last slide, where he says, mere constitution cannot annihilate caste. And at the same time, he says, the oppression cannot be annihilated without the constitution. मैं हिंदी में इसको बता दूं, जेरेमी साहब का कहना यह है कि केवल संविधान कास्ट एनिहिलेशन, कास्ट को नहीं हटा सकता है, कास्ट को खत्म नहीं कर सकता है, कास्टिज्म को, और बगैर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के, बगैर संविधान के जातिवाद खत्म नहीं हो सकता है. सो दिस वी ऑल मस्ट अंडरस्टैंड क्लियरली. वेरी ऑफन वी कोट द आर्टिकल्स ऑफ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन रिगार्डिंग द कास्ट एनिहिलेशन एंड द ऑपरेशंस. हम हर जगह भाषणों में कास्ट एनिहिलेशन की बात करते हैं और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन की आर्टिकल कोट करते हैं, बल्कि हमें चाहिए कि हम संविधान का सहारा लेकर और नए रास्ते तलाश करें कास्ट एनिहिलेशन के. So with this I limit my comment, but I definitely expect the people will pay attention to the last sentence, to the last point of this last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh sir, for highlighting that very important, essential point in his presentation. Any other question, please?
Sir, just I drop a query on the comment box, and I'm expecting some response from Professor Jeremy.
Is
सर
that
आई हैव वन स्मॉल क्वेरी सर। इनकी प्रेजेंटेशन में एक पॉइंट था कि जो पीपल की प्रैक्टिसेस है हमें ऑब्जेक्शन उनसे है, पीपल से नहीं है। हिंदू
right?
प्रैक्टिसेस उनसे
Jeremy,
प्रॉब्लम है, हिंदुओं से
yeah,
प्रॉब्लम नहीं है। तो
important,
वो मैं थोड़ा क्लेरिफाई करना चाहता हूँ।
yeah, important point, wonderful point. Jeremy, Mahendra ji is asking, you said that we do not have problem with the people, but we have problem with the practices. So how do you discriminate people and practices?
Yeah, no, that is a good point, an important point in the field of kind of mediation, and that quote came from, or that idea comes really from a book by Uri and Patton and Fisher, who wrote about principled negotiation and like how do you and I mean when I look at my own president, he needs to read the book. He doesn't understand how to do principled negotiation. He's trying to negotiate over a transaction all the time, transactional, kinds of negotiation. So, yeah, how you do that of separating the people from the problem is not easy. But when mediators talk about it, they often talk about focusing on the interests of the parties as opposed to getting stuck in their positions. So, but the example they use in that book, which I often teach to my students, they call it the orange story. Like and Nagpur is the city of oranges, right? So perfect for if I were in Nagpur, it'd be a perfect story to tell. The fruit, the orange, if you have like the example he uses, if you have two kids who are fighting over that orange and saying, I want the orange, no, I want the orange, I want the orange. Their positions are they want the orange, but what are their underlying interests? And so what Uri and them say is you need to ask the interest question, why do you want the orange? And you might find that there's ways to create what he calls win-win solutions. We often see conflict in win-lose kind of mentalities, right? Or zeros, what in the field we call zero-sum thinking. We often get stuck in zero-sum thinking that if I win, you lose, and if you win, I lose. Whereas in that orange story, it could be if you ask the question, why do you want the orange? That the two kids would say, "Oh, well, I'm interested in I feel like a cold is coming on and I want to eat." One might say, "I want to eat the orange," and the other might say, "I want to make marmalade," which if you know how to make marmalade, you only need the rind from the orange to do that. So you might be able to peel the orange, give one to one person, one to one child, one, and then give the fruit to the other child. Now you've created 100% win-win. They've both gotten what they wanted, but they just weren't communicating that to each other. And I'm not suggesting that that would be that easy in terms of caste oppression, but that mentality, I was suggesting that mentality of thinking of conflict in a kind of less of a zero sum way and thinking about getting at the underlying interests as opposed to the positions is one way to separate the people from the problem. It's not easy, but yeah, because often, and in the Indian context, oftentimes the Hindu community, their practices are very hard to separate from themselves, right? From their self. But I think that it's important for us to remember that. So I was trying to point to that idea. If I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does.
Yeah, thoda sa, thank you very much, Jeremy. If I just try to translate what did you say? Generally, English flows goes well, but because there are some subtle points that needs to be communicated clearly, so that room I don't want to leave the room in confusion. and once it is listened after event is over, it should be documented clearly. जेरेमी जी कहने की कोशिश कर रहे थी कि भाई पीपल और प्रॉब्लम, लोग और समस्या, दोनों को अलग करना बहुत मुश्किल है, क्योंकि वो प्रॉब्लम लोगों में ही होती है। ऐसा उनका कहना है। दूसरे शब्दों में अगर कहा जाए तो बाबा साहब ने ब्राह्मणिज्म और ब्राह्मिन्स, इस दोनों में फ़र्क किया है। तो बाबा साहब ब्राह्मणों के व्यक्ति के खिलाफ नहीं थे, लेकिन वो जो प्रैक्टिसेस है, जो ब्राह्मणिज्म गैर ब्राह्मणों में भी हो सकती है, उसके खिलाफ वो थे। तो एक विशिष्ट व्यक्ति के खिलाफ या विशिष्ट जाति के खिलाफ वो आंदोलन नहीं था, वो एक व्यवस्था के खिलाफ उनकी आवाज़ थी। तो वो पॉइंट बताना चाह रहे कि बाबा साहब ने लोगों को डिनाई नहीं किया, किसी किसी के खिलाफ उन्होंने आवाज़ नहीं उठाई, लेकिन उन्होंने व्यवस्था के खिलाफ आवाज़ उठाई, जो लोगों में एक असमानता और वायलेंस या एट्रोसिटीज़ या डिस्क्रिमिनेशन या निगेटिव या अशांति की भावना प्रदान करता है या लाता है। इसलिए लोगों को समस्याओं से अलग करना चाहिए। समस्या जाति की है, तो जो लोग जाति को प्रैक्टिस करते हैं, उनके लिए लॉज कड़क होने चाहिए या सख्त होने चाहिए। हर आदमी या हर ब्राह्मण कास्टिस्ट है ऐसा बोल देना, ये बाबा साहब की फिलॉसफी को जस्टिफाई नहीं करेगा। क्योंकि जाति गैर ब्राह्मणों में भी है, और ब्राह्मण है इसलिए ब्राह्मणिज्म को फॉलो करता है ऐसा नहीं है। ब्राह्मणिज्म गैर ब्राह्मणों में प्रोबेबली ज़्यादा है। तो वो इम्पोर्टेंट करना ज़रूरी है कि किसी विशिष्ट व्यक्ति या कम्युनिटी या कास्ट के खिलाफ वो ये नहीं है, वो व्यवस्था के खिलाफ है। ये इम्पोर्टेंट है समझना, इसलिए क्योंकि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एक कम्युनिटी के लिए नहीं लिखा गया है, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन देश का है। इस कॉल्ड द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, ये भारतीय संविधान है, जो हर भारतीय किसी भी धर्म, समाज, रिलीजन, स्टेट से आए, उसके लिए वो इक्वली लागू है। ये इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट उन्होंने बताने की कोशिश की। आई होप आई ट्राई टू कम्युनिकेट द स्पिरिट। अरुण जी।
If there is no, yeah,
थैंक यू
just
सर।
need to say when we are discussing or talking about the culture, why such a dominant culture has been introduced in Indian society. Because that a very small section of the society needed to control over the resources. The sole problem, until unless the natural resources like land and other natural resources will not be distributed equally, without accepting this the equal distribution of the resources, how the you can establish a peace. And when you are talking about the togetherness, still in India, we minimum, I personally can say I never found that togetherness. Whenever, like my father was a lawyer, very prominent lawyer, so that ultimately the upper caste society accepted that we are living in a very high dominant upper caste society. But it is an individual case. That doesn't mean that the upper caste society is ready to accept the togetherness. That is what my point. Until unless we will not talk about the equal distribution of the resources, the culture which is being introduced by the people, that is just to control over the resources. If they will withdraw the control over the resources, they will reform their culture by default. That is my point. I need some response from Professor Jeremy. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. I mean, I agree with what you said. It is about power and control, right? I mean, if you just to take an example of what is happening, I don't know if people in India are even aware what's happening in Washington, D.C., a federal city very similar to Delhi. It would be as if Modi decided to send in the national troops and to police the city because he's saying that Delhi has got too much crime. And so the federal government is going to take over the police force. That's what's happened in Washington, D.C., right? And it's a perfect example of that power of use of power and control and abuse of power and control. And until you have spaces to be able to have a conversation with people and I mean, and so one of the things I'm always arguing for when I come to India is trying to create spaces and structures where different castes can come together, because in the Indian context there's very few spaces, public spaces, where that happens. Of course it happens in the marketplace, it happens in these kind of transactional interactions, in taking a rickshaw or taking a Uber across town or something like that. But oftentimes the caste dynamic is not even known, or it's hidden in those contexts until something maybe happens that it comes out, and then maybe some conflict arises. But finding spaces and structures for people to come together to have conversation about exactly this. How would we redistribute wealth in a way? How would we redistribute land in a way? I mean, this is a conversation, of course, the powerful don't want to necessarily have. So they're not going to be willing to necessarily sit down, but that doesn't mean that the powerful have to be a part of that conversation right away. That conversation can be being had amongst various communities, building solidarity between Muslim communities and Buddhist community, Dalit Buddhist communities, building solidarity between. I mean, I'm often amazed, like, and I was learning even some myself this last semester, well, last spring. I went out west and spent a lot of time with Ravidasi communities, and the tensions between within low caste communities is there, right? Between, say, Ravidasis and Dalit Buddhists from Maharashtra, and not just tension or disagreement, but lack of solidarity and lack of understanding of what their experience is. It's not the same. Ravidasis don't have exactly the same experience as somebody who's coming from Maharashtra, right? And so, like, figuring out ways that those communities can come together and start to have these conversations about power and control, so that it could then grow to other communities, and eventually, and again, that's the kind of generational view of peace building. It's not, you're not going to bring the BJP leadership together to sit down and have conversations about devolving power and um, spreading the wealth, if you will, around land resources or other economic resources right away. But I think there's a way to move towards those kinds of discussions. But people have to be willing to engage with communities other than their own and build solidarity. And we see that, I mean, just to come to the diaspora, we see that in the diaspora context as well. Younger populations of people of South Asian diaspora communities here are seeing racial dynamics, gender dynamics, other things that they're understanding in new ways and saying, oh, and they haven't interrogated their caste hierarchies and their caste, some of them their caste privilege, right? And some of the younger groups of South Asians are starting to kind of realize, oh, I guess I need to, and that's good. That's a good thing. It's pushing people towards that space to dialogue. I was going to respond to, since I've got the floor right now, to I was interested in the question Amit put in about the differences between Gandhi's approach to nonviolence and Dr. Ambedkar's approach. And yeah, I mean, I think there's subtle differences there, because as I was sitting here thinking, it's a good question. And as I was sitting here thinking about it, I was thinking about, my perception of Gandhi and nonviolence is often a kind of a strategic approach, right? It's what there's a Gene Sharp, a famous he's now passed away, but a famous American nonviolent practitioner named Gene Sharp, who wrote about what he called strategic nonviolence, and he argued you don't have to have any kind of religious basis to do nonviolence. It's a strategy, and it's an effective strategy if done correctly. And he identified 179, I think it was, different ways in which people can strategically do nonviolence. I oftentimes think of Gandhi and nonviolence in that way. But of course, Gandhi had ahimsa behind what he was doing and had a kind of religious vision of his Satyagraha movement. I think that's Ambedkar also had, I think their visions were slightly different, and the kind of the root values of those visions were slightly different. Whereas Gandhi was focusing on ahimsa and the Bhagavad Gita, Ambedkar was focusing on codependent origination and interdependence and kind of Buddhist ideas of nonviolence. They're both important. I wouldn't say that I think both of them. So I think there's a lot of, I guess it's a subtle distinction. I think um, the nonviolence of Ambedkar and the nonviolence of Gandhi, if it was kind of a Venn diagram, would be largely overlapping. They're very similar in lots of ways, but then slight differences in the kind of root of the values that are driving that, and the experiences that are driving that. I mean, Gandhi had his own experiences of discrimination in South Africa, right? As a South Asian in a land that he wasn't seen as white, right? So it was a racial kind of discrimination, racial national discrimination that he was facing, right? And that influenced his approach to nonviolence. Ambedkar, of course, had a different set of experiences of discrimination around caste, which drove his, and race and caste are not the same thing. They don't create the same traumas either in that sense. They create similar trauma. So it's almost like I think about it, I guess, as I was thinking about the question, I was thinking about it as almost like a Venn diagram. They would overlap largely, but there might be slight distinctions based on their experiences of how they came to nonviolence and based upon their kind of different the roots of their values, their value base. Um, so I don't know if that's helpful, but that's it. I think it's a great question.
May I add a bit line, sir, about
Sure.
that? When Gandhi went on fast unto death against the separate electorates given to scheduled caste, Dr. Ambedkar, in an interview to the BBC, he said it is a worse sort of violence against self. It's a violence. Fast unto death is a violence towards your own self. It's a threat.
Yeah.
So his non-violence was more strategic. You are right. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, he was quite angry and frustrated by the Pune Pact, right? I mean, he was famously quoted in the by a journalist, I think, as he left Pune prison. What was I supposed to kill the Mahatma? Right? I mean, that to me shows that he was quite frustrated with, yeah, I capitulated to Gandhi in this case because, and I think that's an example, the Pune Pact is one example of and I think there may be others, but one example of the kind of immoral use of strategic nonviolence to get your political, uh, needs met or aims met. And in that case, Gandhi was using the fast, I think, immorally in order to get his point across, and he won. I mean, he won that argument, but in a an immoral way.
Gaikwad, Bharat Gaikwad ji, do you have anything to comment or question? I see a hand raise anyway. Is there any other question with respect to the time frame? Maybe we can have a last question or something.
Sir, I dropped something on comment box.
Sir, why don't you just speak
Any
out, sir?
more questions? I think you can have a Jeremy's email ID.
Yes.
I think it's better to interact with him in that channel. I think already we entered in 1.5 hours.
Yes.
So I think that this will be the
I
last question.
I
Great.
I
Chandra, great.
I I wholeheartedly thank Professor Jeremy behalf of CDS and the team for delivering such a insightful and engaging conversation. I hope participants have benefited from it. And thank you very much for sparing your time, Jeremy.
There is one hand up. I don't know if you want to. We can. I'm fine to stay on a little longer and respond. I don't know if.
Thanks to, I think, final we can conclude it. I think Jeremy's last words already. Dinesh Chandra's is presented his
Jeremy, sir, I'll
views.
share my email ID with you.
So then, what is important thing is now in India, we are more discussions on theory level. Then some people are doing in the practical level also. I am not denying, but same time, this lecture could be the very inspired thing to the whoever activist in the field. Then another thing is, I think so many people read it. Ambedkar told in so many times, caste will not be abolished without assent of the, without agree of the Hindu community. It's not possible. But same time, we have to build a movement to realize them, to change them, to whatever. Otherwise, we can change ourselves and overcome all those hurdles. That is the whole practical things are now is discussing in the whole social media, all those things. But this lecture would be the important thing. Another thing is so many people are thinking to have a constitution is not working, constitution is waste, constitution nothing, anything like that. That arguments are also very high in the society. But this lecture, I think, resolve some things. Constitution alone cannot solve, at the same time, without constitution cannot achieve. This is a very important thinking to understand our problem. Thank you very much, Professor Jeremy, and thanks, Professor Santosh, and other people also who gave the time to attend this meeting. I think I am very happy with this today's meeting. I think we are now reaching 60th lecture next week. Then we can have another 15 lectures more. I think without break, without any hurdle, we continue this lecture series. I think I very much thanks to all. This juncture, this series, I think I'm very much thankful to Santosh to take initiate and continue this our journey. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Santosh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lalit, thank you very much for joining. And Venkat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Professor
Yes.
Jeremy, very much thankful to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy, and all my CDS and Malapal Lakshmaya. It was so illuminating. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Sir,
Professor Jeremy.
we are
And
concluding.
Santosh Bhai, of course to you.
Thank you.
Now he is
Really.
the leader of the series. This thing.
Santosh,
Okay, sir.
Thank you, Santosh Bhai.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeremy sir, whenever you come anytime in India, I would like to meet you wherever you are. You will be.
Okay.
And when are we going to get the email ID of Jeremy, sir?
And the Dropbox